The Two Roses by Alan Upward. It would give needless pain to members of the family who are still living in the neighbourhood if I were to go into the circumstances in which the ancient seat of the Hedges of Essex came into the market. It is only necessary to say that the solicitors from whom my firm received instructions to find a purchaser for the estate were not acquainted with the family history, and could tell us nothing definite on the subject of the incidents, real or imaginary, which had given an evil reputation to Bewley Hall. They were only able to inform us that one entire wing of the building, constituting the most ancient and characteristic portion, had been shut up for a great length of time, so long, indeed, that no one seemed able to remember when it had last been inhabited. I discussed the matter with Miss Alwyne Sargent, the young lady employed in our office, who had already given me such valuable assistance on similar occasions. She possessed the gift of clairvoyance, and had proved of incalculable assistance in explaining away mysteries connected with several residences. These were, notably, the Greenhouse, Wallington, Halesbury Manor, and Horner's Court. I had already become well known as a dealer in haunted property, and made a satisfactory profit on my transactions, buying the premises cheap and selling at a profit when the mysteries were cleared up. I was reluctant to expose her to the risk of another nervous shock, although she herself was quite eager to take her usual part in our joint investigations. I thought, however, it could do no harm for her to come down with me to make some preliminary inquiries. None of the furniture and effects had yet been removed from the mansion, and there was a farm bailiff occupying rooms with his family in the servants' quarter, so that it was easy to arrange for a visit. The rather senseless difficulty of a chaperone for my Lady Clerk was disposed of by my sister Jane, who surprised me by requesting that she might make one of the party. Jane had not previously met Miss Sargent, but she had heard me speak of her once or twice, and appeared anxious, for some reason, to make her acquaintance. I was a little disappointed to find that Alwyn did not seem equally eager to meet my sister. In fact, she went so far as to say that she felt nervous at the prospect. I could only assure her that my sister Jane was a most unassuming, ordinary person, quiet, shrewd, and observant, and, moreover, devoted to me. But this information did not allay Miss Sargent's apprehensions, which seemed to increase as the moment for our departure drew near. The ceremony of introduction took place on the platform at Liverpool Street. Both ladies, I thought, were more carefully dressed than seemed necessary for a purely business journey, on which we were to meet no one of any consequence. I caught a look of surprise on my sister's face as Alwyn came up, and she took the first opportunity to whisper to me, almost in a tone of reproach, "Jack, you never told us she was a beauty." "Miss Sargent is a valued member of our clerical staff," I replied severely. "Her looks are of no concern of ours, so long as they do not interfere with her faithful discharge of her duties in the office." Jane looked dissatisfied, but she did not venture on any further remark. During the journey down, she watched the poor girl as closely as a cat watches a canary bird through the bars of its cage. Fortunately, Miss Sargent soon got over her first nervousness, and exerted herself to conciliate my sister, with such good effect that by the time we reached Saffron Walden we were all chatting like old friends. Jane rather embarrassed me by forgetting the business relationship between Miss Sargent and myself, and referring to me repeatedly by my Christian name, so that I was rather glad that my partner Mortimer was not present. We found Bewley Hall to be an ancient manor house of the Elizabethan type, built of red brick, which was mellowed by age and overgrown in many places with ivy and climbing plants. The principal feature was a large and lofty hall, on much the same design as the London Guildhall, but on a smaller scale. It was stone-paved, and was panelled halfway up the walls with very valuable old oak. The hall, I must explain, separated the two wings, or halves, composing the mansion. The modern portion, which had been in constant use up to the death of the late owner, had been built on to the great hall at its lower end. The haunted wing, if it should be so called, was connected with the upper end. Here there was a dais, also paved with stone, stretching from side to side of the hall. The door into the ancient wing opened off one side of the dais, and on the opposite side was another, smaller door, like a postern, which we found led into a little rose garden behind the house. The only other feature that I need dwell on was a gallery, which the bailiff's wife, who showed us over the place, called the musicians' gallery. It overlooked the dais, facing the door into the rose garden, and when we went upstairs, we found it was approached by a corridor that traversed the whole length of the haunted wing. The woman who acted as our guide was very uncommunicative, partly, I believe, because she really had heard very little, and partly because she fancied that she would lower herself in our eyes by betraying any interest in the lore of superstition. When I asked her if she could tell us anything about the ghost, she tossed her head in disdain. "I don't know of any ghost," she declared, "and I don't hold with any talk about such things. It's only the labourers that believes in them hereabouts." The social cleavage thus indicated forbade further inquiry. The bailiff's wife informed us, however, that the disused part of the mansion had been shut up long before she was born, and she made a great deal of difficulty about letting us spend the night in it. "It's all dust and cobwebs," she explained to me. "Everything there is exactly as it was left 100 years ago and more, I should say. Your ladies couldn't possibly put up with the dirt and the damp." We explored the wing under her guidance, and its appearance served to confirm her account. The old hangings clung mouldering to the walls. Ancient weapons, grown rusty with neglect, were suspended along the sides of the corridor. In the bedrooms, old four-poster beds were covered with the embroidered quilts of another age, and the robes and brocades of a past generation still filled the closets. Even my staid and demure sister could not resist the temptation to rummage in some of the cupboards and examine the decayed fineries they contained, while I felt no less strongly attracted by the fine specimens of 17th and 18th century arms. I found that one superbly mounted pistol, which I took down from its place, actually had the left barrel still loaded, though the priming had long since disappeared. Alwyne approached me as I was examining the pistol, and I showed her the flints, still in the hammers. She regarded the weapon with peculiar attention, taking it in her hand with a meditative, musing look. "I wonder how the other barrel came to be discharged," she said. So far, we had been able to glean nothing from the impenetrable obstinacy of our guide. After selecting our rooms, which the woman reluctantly promised to provide with some bedding from the other part of the house, we came back into the great hall. I have already mentioned the dais, which occupied one end, with the two doors opening off it. Across the dais there extended an ancient table, long and narrow, made of a single beam of oak. Someone threw out the suggestion that we three should dine at this seignorial board, in imitation of the olden time. When I requested the bailiff's wife to make the necessary arrangements, she exhibited some slight dismay. "Of course it's for you to do as you wish, sir," she said, "but perhaps your ladies don't know that this is the table that has the blood-stain on it." We seized eagerly upon this allusion. "What blood-stain? Where?" we demanded, crowding round the black and venerable board. The woman pointed to the end of the table nearest to the door into the rose garden. Surely enough, the wood seemed to have a darker tinge at one particular spot. The mark was about the size of a man's hand. "Is there a story about this stain?" I asked, hoping to get upon the track of the ghostly legend of the Hall. But the woman could not, or would not, be drawn. "It's an old secret in the family, I've heard, how the stain got there. I don't rightly call to mind what it was, but I do think there was a murder in the Hall. Some say it was 100 years ago, and some 200, and the murderer was Sir William Hedges. But anyway, the table hasn't been used from that day to this, and the family never would have it touched." Miss Sargent showed herself intensely interested in this account, scanty as it was. "Who knows that there may not be some sympathetic force concentrated in this particular spot?" she said, reflectively. "I think that instead of our dining here, and possibly disturbing the magnetism of the table, it will be better for us to try to hold a seance here at night." Although my recent experiences had cured me of a good deal of scepticism with regard to the occult, I still draw the line at ordinary spirit rapping. I hinted as much to Alwyne. "That is not exactly what I meant," she explained. "I merely believe it possible that if I can establish a magnetic rapport with this table, I may feel some direction given to me which will help us." My sister, I could see, was a good deal puzzled by this mystic language. In the end, however, Miss Sargent had her way. We dined and spent the first part of the evening in the modern side of the building, and then adjourned about 10 o'clock to the dark and echoing hall. We placed ourselves round the end of the table which bore the faded mark of blood, and extinguished the candles we had brought with us. It was a bright, moonlight night, and the white rays that streamed in on us through a huge mullioned window filled the hall with shadows that were startling in their distinctness. Whether because of this brightness, or from any other cause, our sitting had no immediate results. If Miss Sargent were susceptible to any influence, magnetic or otherwise, this was evidently not the right occasion for it. After a quarter of an hour had passed in silence, she rose suddenly from the table with a sigh, and announced her intention of retiring to sleep. "It is only when I am asleep that I seem to be sensitive," she remarked. "I do not know how it is. This spot fascinates me, and yet if I sat here all night I don't believe anything would happen." I allowed the two ladies to go upstairs by themselves. The old hall fascinated me by its emptiness and silence, and I paced up and down on the paved floor, smoking a cigar, and pondering a certain question which my sister's attitude towards Alwyne had forced me to look in the face. How long was I going to allow Alwyne Sargent to hazard her nerves, and possibly her brain, in these uncanny experiments? I asked myself the question no longer as it concerned the clerk in our office on whom I depended, but as it concerned the girl who, a stubborn old bachelor as I was, had actually made me think it possible that I might do worse than part with my freedom. I wish it to be distinctly understood that there was no foolish nonsense in my mind when I thought of Alwyne. I judged her calmly in the light of reason. She appeared to me a good daughter, a good sister, and a thoroughly agreeable companion. In short, an ideal wife for a sensible business-man. I took out of my pocket a rose which she had accidentally dropped in the garden, and which I had picked up and forgotten to return to her. I was in the act of raising it to my face, when suddenly I heard a sigh. I turned round quickly. I was standing just below the dais at the time, and saw the door of the haunted wing slowly swing open to the width of a couple of feet, as though it were being opened just enough to let someone through. At the same moment, I was conscious of a subtle change in my surroundings, which I can hardly describe. except by saying that I felt as though I had fallen asleep and awakened again, in a different life. The general aspect of the ancient hall remained the same, and yet, somehow, everything in it looked slightly less distinct, as though the faintest possible veil had been drawn between me and the objects at which I looked. The moon was not less bright, and the shadows it threw were not less black than before, but nevertheless, both light and shadow had become less real, so to speak. At the same time, I was conscious that the change was as much in myself as in the objects round me. I seemed to breathe less vigorously, and to be deprived, for a time, of the power, or rather of the will, to move, or take any part in what was about to happen. The door opened, as far as I have said, and then stopped. I gazed with the most intense curiosity to see who was coming in, but no one appeared. Only I could have sworn that someone, or something, had slipped through that open space, and was gliding softly across the dais, towards the end of the table which bore the faded stain. I turned my eyes, following the course of the unseen visitant, till it had reached the fatal spot. And then, to my astonishment and horror, I did see something. I saw a rose of the palest yellow or white, lying as if it had just been laid down by an invisible hand, on the exact spot marked by the stain of blood. I stood still for a few moments, expecting something to follow. Then, as I again turned my eyes in the direction of the door, I saw it close again, as gently as it had opened, and without any visible agency. How long I stood, in a manner enchanted, gazing from the closed door to the white rose lying on the board, I cannot say. It seemed half a minute. It may have been half an hour. Then I was aroused by a sound which clearly belonged to the world of reality. It reached me from above, and on looking up, I saw that a figure had appeared in the musicians' gallery, which I have described as overlooking the dais. At first sight, I could have imagined that this figure was only a phantom of the brain, in keeping with the extraordinary illusion which I had just experienced. But as it moved forward to the front of the gallery, I recognized that it was Alwyne herself. She appeared to have come out of her sleeping room, unnoticed by my sister, and to have found her way into the gallery, while in that somnambulistic state which I had witnessed on previous occasions. On the way, she had assumed a curious disguise, in the shape of a heavy riding cloak, which she must have found among the ancient relics scattered about the old wing. Clad in this garment, she reached the balustrade of the gallery, and peered down at the mysterious rose. She stood like that, in an attitude of the most intent watchfulness, for some minutes. Then I saw her drop suddenly down on the floor of the gallery, concealing herself behind the balustrade, and shrouding all but her face beneath the folds of the cloak. Unable to understand the cause of this singular manoeuvre, I gazed round the hall for some change that might account for it. The face of the somnambulist was turned in the direction of the door into the garden. I watched this door steadily, half expecting to see it open, as the other door had appeared to do, but this time the spell which had governed my faculties ceased to operate, and I neither saw nor heard anything happen below in the hall. It was different with the figure crouched in the gallery above. After an interval of time, which must have corresponded closely with that required for someone to enter from the rose garden and make his way to where the rose had been lying, I saw Alwyne rise slowly to her full height, cast aside the thick cloak, and extend her hand in the direction of the fatal spot. The next instant there was a click, followed by a spark, as the flint of the pistol which she had been grasping struck against the rusty pan. At the same moment her hand loosed the weapon, which fell crashing on the pavement below. It was the very pistol which I had idly examined in the course of the afternoon. The noise, or the accomplishment of her purpose, put an end to the sleepwalker's trance. She made a natural movement of surprise, looked all about her, and caught sight of me. "Where am I? What has happened?" she called out, breathlessly. I told her in a few words what I had seen. "You came out onto the gallery, wearing that cloak, and hid yourself behind the balustrade, after looking at the white rose on the table. Then, at the end of a few minutes, you stood up and fired in that direction. You have just dropped the pistol on the floor of the hall." I was startled by Alwyne's response. "But that rose, the rose on the table, is not white. It is red." I looked, and as surely as I am writing these lines, the rose which I had seen lying there, white in the moonlight, had changed to the colour of blood red. Certain by this time that my senses were deceiving me, I made 2 steps of it to the spot. The rose had gone. I swept my hand over the place where it had lain, as I cried out to Alwyne, "There is nothing here." "I can see it still," she replied. "Come down, for heaven's sake, or let me come to you and get a light," I shouted back, thoroughly unnerved. She moved back slowly from the gallery, first casting the cloak once more about her shoulders. I went and opened the door of the wing, and presently she came in sight, descending the stairs with a lighted lamp. She passed her hand across her forehead, as she observed, "I am afraid the strain of these experiences is beginning to tell on me. Even now I am hardly sure whether I am awake or asleep." I led her out onto the dais. This time there was no room for doubt. Neither white rose nor red was any longer there to tease the fancy. The old oak board lay in the moonlight, black and smooth as when we had seen it first. Late as it was, we could not forbear questioning each other as to the experiences of the past half-hour. I described to Alwyne what I had seen, or imagined, and pressed her to explain her own part in the strange episode. Unfortunately, she could remember nothing of what had passed in her somnambulistic state. She could only guess that she must have been impersonating in a dream the principal actor in that grim tragedy which the old hall had witnessed a century or more ago. We were interrupted by the appearance of my sister Jane, whom the sound of the falling pistol had roused. Something in the expression of my sister's face induced me to whisper hastily in Alwyne's ear, "May I tell her you have made me a promise, and will you keep it?" With the nature of that promise, and its subsequent fulfilment, the reader has no concern. There, as far as we knew, ended the story of Bewley Hall. But in due time I found a purchaser for the estate, for whom the romantic associations of the old hall were the principal attraction. He exerted himself to trace the history of Sir William Hedges, and succeeded in getting into communication with a member of the family, a rather remote descendant, who was induced to supply the following particulars. Late in life, that is to say, after he had passed his 60th year, Sir William took an old man's fancy for the daughter of his parish clergyman, a girl of scarcely 17. Rosamond, as she was named, showed the greatest reluctance to marry the knight, for no reason that she was willing to assign, except his great age. Her father and mother dazzled by Sir William's wealth and his promises on behalf of their daughter, forced her into the match, and in due course she went to live in the Hall as Sir William's wife. But, unknown to her parents, and of course to her new husband, Rosamond had secretly given her heart to a penniless young gentleman of the Greville family, living some 20 miles away. Unable to bear the prospect of losing each other altogether, the lovers agreed upon a method of communication, which they meant should be wholly innocent. Once in every month, when the moon was at the full, young Greville was to ride across to Bewley Hall by night, and obtain entrance through the door of the rose garden, of which Rosamond provided him with a key. Rosamond, on her part, was to descend into the hall, after her lord had fallen asleep, and place a white rose upon the table, as a token that all was well, and that she still preserved her fidelity to her first love. On entering the hall, and finding the white rose there, Greville was to take it away with him, leaving a red rose in its place as an answering pledge. For some months the lovers kept up their romantic tryst without discovery. But at last there came a night when it had rained hard during the day, and unwittingly the lover brought in some of the mud of the rose garden on his boots, and left it on the stones of the hall. As ill luck would have it, Sir William woke that morning early, and came down before the household was astir. He noticed the mud stains and the red rose upon the table, and, following up the scent, discovered the hoof-prints of Greville's horse outside. Firmly believing the worst, the knight swore to be revenged upon his unknown rival, and from that time he set himself to watch, night after night, for an opportunity of surprising him. When the appointed night came round again, Sir William, who was, as usual, watching, while feigning to be asleep, saw his wife rise from his side, take a white rose in her hand, and go down into the hall. Leaving the bedchamber directly after her, the knight armed himself with a loaded pistol, and went and hid himself in the musicians' gallery to see what would follow. He failed to see his wife, who was already returning upstairs again. But before Rosamond had made the discovery of her husband's vigilance, the door of the rose garden was opened, and young Greville stole in, with a red rose in his hatband. He was in the act of stretching out his fingers to pick up the rose left by his sweetheart, when Sir William fired. The ball pierced the lover's heart, and he fell forward, his blood gushing over the white flower, which it dyed to the colour of that one he had been going to replace it with. Immediately, Lady Hedges, who had that moment found her husband's place vacant, ran shrieking out into the gallery, and flung herself headlong down beside her lover's corpse, breaking her neck against the ground. This awful catastrophe served to unsettle the reason of its author, whom the law refrained from punishing. He caused the hall to be shut up, and when he died, many years after, he so ordered it by his will that none should reopen the ancient building, nor profane the scene of the tragedy with any sort of pleasure or diversion, as long as the hall should remain in the hands of his descendants. The above narrative, I need not remark, exactly fits in with the experiences I have just related, and which the reader is at liberty to accept or reject, as he may please. You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by Simon Stanhope. For more stories like this, please try the links below, and do click subscribe and hit the bell to hear about future uploads. You may also be interested in becoming a channel member. There are a few options available with various benefits. Click the Join button to find out more. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2021. Thank you for listening.